Thank you for joining us today, Scott Burchill, and welcome to Bogan Intelligentsia.
It's good to be here, Joel.
I wanted just to firstly kick off with the situation in Ukraine. There's been a dramatic escalation over the last couple of weeks. I was just wondering if you could provide some developments and explain those developments to begin with.
Well, it's tempting to say that the attack, particularly on the various military Air Force bases across Russia, and the explosion in the one of the bridges linking Crimea to the mainland, have something to do with developments that Trump, Zelensky, and Putin have been dealing with in terms of the possible negotiations, whether it be in Istanbul or in the Vatican or wherever. But some of these military operations have taken over a year to prepare for. So I think we have to disconnect what's happening from the immediate political developments, which we're seeing being played out in the sort of diplomatic world and in the public relations world, where there's been an increase in pressure, particularly recently on Ukraine, to compromise and reach a peaceful settlement with the Russians. It's clear Trump doesn't have the kind of leverage over Putin that he boasted of having prior to the election in November last year. But nevertheless, I think despite the sort of spectacular nature of these attacks, it really doesn't alter the overall balance within that conflict. Russia is not going to suddenly withdraw. The Ukrainians are not going to suddenly retake a whole lot of territory. So ultimately, it's going to be a political and diplomatic solution. The question is who is going to buckle first, I guess. And although Trump tried to apply pressure on Zelensky in the White House meeting, that infamous one with J.D. Vance was there, Zelensky is clearly not in the mood at the moment to compromise too much.
Would you feel that, since the "you're not holding the cards" was released, that Zelensky is taking a different approach, or is this year and a half planned operation something that's being done with the blessing of Washington and the UK?
Well, the reports were that Washington wasn't given prior notice of them, and although they're kind of like what you might call a cut-priced attack using relatively cheap technology, drones, to deliver visually devastating and I guess if you knock out almost half the Russian Air Force, quite significant damage to their military capacity. So I think this sort of tells the world that Ukraine is not in the mood for giving up, that the war isn't, they don't regard the war as being a lost cause as far as they're concerned. And but at the same time, it's not going to progress Ukraine's own cause particularly, because they're not incapable of making significant gains on the ground where things count. So they don't have the capacity to, for example, reverse the gains of the Russian armed forces in the disputed territories now occupied by the Russians, including places like Lugansk and Donetsk. So I'm not sure that we're going to see a significant change in approach, but there is a worry now that there will be enormous retaliation from the Russians as a result of these attacks. And the Russians have shown no particular need to distinguish between competence and non-competence in some of their military operations. So the question is, how will they respond, and what impact will that have on morale, both within Ukraine generally, but also on the Ukrainian leadership? And my expectation is that we'll have a kind of status quo ante after all these so-called dramatic events play themselves out. We're still really not dealing with the fundamental issues at stake, which will lead to a solution, or at least an end to hostilities.
And with Trump's taking a back step with regards to his panacea that he was offering to cure the conflict in Ukraine, and these attacks happening on the eve of much awaited and maligned peace talks in Turkey, do we think that this sends a different message than what we've seen before, that potentially Russia might upgrade its special military operation into a full-scale war? And has the fact that a strategic bomber was the target here, strategic bombers, which hold a part of Russia's nuclear triad, does this escalate to a place that we really haven't seen in modern times? Or is it another part of the saber rattling and the stalemate, as you just mentioned?
Well, we better hope it doesn't escalate too much, because no one will win from that. And I think Ukraine will be expecting a sort of tit for tat kind of retaliation, which might escalate to at least the extent of taking civilian targets out. But really, that's not going to make a huge, significant difference to the overall outcome in the months ahead. But it's interesting, if you're reading the tea leaves in the Trump administration, there seems to be a change of tone, particularly since that infamous White House meeting where Zelensky was being dismissed as a kind of guy with no cards to play. Now there's a sort of grudging respect that the Ukrainians have more to offer and perhaps more resilience than they're expected to have, and are prepared to take the fight to the Russians, as well as the fact, in combination, Trump realizing that the kind of leverage he thought he might have over Putin is just not there. So we might see threats. We've seen threats of sanctions being increased on Russia. That's come from Lindsey Graham, but it's also come from Trump himself. So if there's no outcome in the short term, and if the talks are a kind of waste of time, then it's hard to know exactly whether it's hard to see the United States continuing to show much interest in this current administration. They may just decide that we'll deal with the issue in the Middle East instead, which may, believe it or not, appear to be an easier one to resolve, and let the Ukrainians and the Russians sort it out themselves. That obviously defies what Trump said he was going to do. I think he said he would, in a few days he would end the war, but clearly he realizes he's up against a much greater set of complex factors than he expected.
So are we seeing the Trump administration sort of coming to reality here as it learns to understand these conflicts, and realizes that, these panaceas and these kind of in one day it's over statements that have been made are completely useless, and they're in the same quagmire as the previous administration with regards especially to Putin and the diplomacy there, and potentially the Middle East as well?
Yes, look, I think what Trump thought is that he'd have because he's got a better personal relationship with Putin, that he might be able to forge some kind of agreement or mediate an agreement between Trump and Zelensky. Between Putin and Zelensky. But he's finding, of course, that the Russians have their own interests at stake. They're pursuing their own course of action as they see it, and they don't necessarily align with the interests of the White House. Now, what those interests might be is interesting. Is it Trump just wanting to win a Nobel Prize? Is it Trump wanting to show how deft he is at international diplomacy, that he can resolve issues simply by force of character, or by contacts, or by brokering a deal because he's a deal maker? But I think what we're really going to see is just a gradual reduction in the interest shown by the White House in that particular conflict, because the longer they sort of claim to have a stake in it, or the potential for resolving it or mediating it, when nothing happens, they just look stupid. Meanwhile, of course, the events in the Middle East are going to preoccupy them full time anyway, I would think, and where those developments are in many ways a little bit more interesting in terms of changing attitudes, and we'll see how that's going to play itself out. But there has been a very interesting set of dynamic changes to the relationship between the White House, Trump in particular, and the Netanyahu government in Israel, in relation to not just the resolution of the conflict with Hamas, but also in policy towards Iran. And that may be the big issue that we really need to examine more closely.
Now, speaking to that conflict and keeping in line with the diplomatic options that Washington's using at the moment, uh, we're seeing that taco term being used for Trump. I think Wall Street coined it. Taco stands for Trump, always chickens out, I think. They're
Yeah.
using it, for the markets and the saber rattling with China. It could be said that the same approach is being used with Ukraine, but potentially it could be being used in the Middle East too. And I wanted to speak to the flip-flopping and the sort of opaque and murky messaging coming out of, say, Special Envoy Witkoff, for example, who's sort of saying one thing, doing the other, talking to the other party and doing the same thing. And at the moment, say with Iran, I think his conduct and his messaging has kind of damaged the negotiations there, when Iran's feeling a little bit more on the back foot than they were potentially a couple of months ago with regards to good faith. Do you think that this is an issue, that Trump's administration is kind of selling a whole bunch of messages at once in a different way to, say, the Biden administration? And do you think that this is detrimental to solving this conflict, as you think, Trump may see some angle to doing so?
Yeah, I think they're trying to keep too many balls in the air at the one time. On the one hand, they're cracking down on the university sector, on the issue of anti-Semitism, but also obviously the ICE department excluding foreign students, and the particular fight they're having with Harvard as a result of that, which is escalating. So there's that issue. There's also, you've got to remember that Trump had enormous financial backing from some of Israel's leading American supporters. And so he is limited in the extent to which he can part ways, even if he was inclined to do so, from supporting Israel's position, particularly on the Palestinian issue, because he took a lot of money from the U.S. lobby, from the Israel lobby, I should say, and he's obviously can't just throw that back in their face. On the other hand, Hamas has exposed Witkoff as someone who basically speaks out different sides of his mouth at the same time,
Yes.
and who seems to have promised some kind of conditional ceasefire as part of a deal, and then welched on that afterwards and went back behind their back and said it was, when that was imposed or suggested by Hamas only a few days ago, said that it was totally unacceptable. So that would suggest Trump's moving back towards a more similar position to Israel on the question of what they're going to do in Gaza. And I think that's a real stalemate at the moment in that sense. On Iran, it's slightly different, because Israel does not want a nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran, and they'll do everything to sabotage it. And they're very worried about Trump trying to sort of revive some JCPOA type agreement that had been struck under the Obama administration, which allowed the Iranians to enrich uranium for peaceful electrical purposes rather than for military purposes. But the Iranians, I think, have, observing how they've been double dealing, how the Americans have been double dealing with Hamas, are probably very wary of taking anything that the Trump administration says on face value. And they want to make sure that if there's an agreement, that it will be something they can't back out of. And you're now seeing people like Chuck Schumer, in the leader, sort of minority leader in the Senate for the Democrats, saying there shouldn't be any side deals with Iran, as if somehow or other Trump is slipping to being too pro-Iranian, which will come as a huge surprise to the Iranians, I would think. And they've got that sort of pressure as well. But the interesting dynamic to focus on here is the extent to which Trump is prepared to defy Netanyahu on Iran. He may be happy to go along with him on Gaza, but on Iran, which is in many ways for international political purposes a much more vital issue, if he does breach with Netanyahu, that is going to dramatically alter US-Israel relations, over the rest of his term of office, because that's a much more important priority for Netanyahu and his government than resettling the West Bank or turning Gaza into some kind of Riviera.
So you think that potentially the genocide is something that's been assigned to Netanyahu? That's something you can potentially deal with, but when it comes to Iran, there is a more there is a firm, like there is a wall being built by Washington, or a line in the sand, essentially. This does contrast with the constant language coming out of Tel Aviv about they being prepared to go ahead with a strike on nuclear facilities without America, always forcing Washington's hand to support them by inevitability. I spoke about the Trump administration coming to understanding these flashpoints in their own terms, and starting to sort of understand the hopelessness of them. Do you think there's still some blind spots in this Trump administration that are quite dangerous due to the belligerence and the unhinged nature of Israel at the moment? That they don't quite have a line of sight to the intentions of Tel Aviv, to the incendiary nature of their plans to the region, that this could actually slip into a crisis rather quickly. I am also talking to Iran maybe being in a position now behind closed doors where diplomatically they feel that they haven't really been getting anything that gives them peace of mind. And they may be prepared to have their backs to the wall and launch a salvo of rockets at some point. So yeah, I'm sort of wondering how, does Trump have enough of a line on this right now to stop it turning into World War III potentially?
Well, I think the two differences, but the main difference between Gaza and the Iran issue is that Gaza and the genocide in Gaza can be accomplished without US troops and without US strikes, but with US munitions and British munitions. So there can be a kind of distance between an American presence there to accomplish what the Israelis want to do in Gaza. Both Israel and the United States know that Israel cannot take on Iran in a full-time capacity without US involvement. In fact, it's been the policy for 20 years or more of Netanyahu and people like him to convince the United States to take the lead on attacking Iran. But the Trump administration knows a couple of things. One is that Iran is no pushover. It wants, obviously, relief from sanctions that are crippling its economy, but it's no pushover, and there won't be any easy victory there, no matter what scale the attack is. Iran can retaliate. But also, there was, as you might recall, some double dealing going on with Netanyahu and Trump's national security advisor, who seemed to be collaborating behind Trump's back about getting the US involved in an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities.
This is Waltz, yes?
Yeah, Waltz, who had to be sacked. And I think Trump was very angry, not just with Waltz, who was easy to get rid of, but also angry that Netanyahu had done what he did to Obama, in a sense, and that is go behind his back and plant the seed of getting support for an attack on Iran from those senior officials within the Trump administration, but also from Congress. And he didn't like that at all. And that was, in a sense, the trigger for Trump to take on a more conciliatory approach to the Iranians in seeing if a deal can be managed. Now, the Iranians don't trust Trump with very good reason, but what they have in their favor is the fact that Trump does not trust Netanyahu on the question of Iran, and it knows that the Israelis want to use the Americans as their sort of frontline attack force, and they can, as you said, they can do some limited attacks, they can fire missiles, but so can Iran retaliate in a similar way, as we've already seen occurred.
Could we safely say that potentially that's the policy of the foreign policy class in Washington and has been for quite some time now? I mean, they might not be inclined to say it as much, but there's an agreement and a consensus that war with Iran is just off the cards.
Yes, that has been for a long time. It's just there's nothing for the US to gain from this. The Israelis might think, the Iranians are responsible for all their proxies, Hezbollah and Lebanon and Hamas and Gaza and other groups around the region, and they're causing them trouble. And we have the rhetoric of, the terrorist state of Iran. But those issues don't affect the United States in a tremendously direct way. They might affect Israel. So what is to be gained by Washington taking on or picking on a fight with Iran directly? One that they can't really be absolutely assured they would win, and they can't even really define what those war goals would be. Because if you say, well, we're just going to take out their nuclear facilities, they can't be sure that they'll get them all, and they can always be rebuilt later on. Remember, the secret about nuclear capacity is the information and the intelligence, and to know how to build them. And that's not something you can bomb into oblivion.
And Iran's known for having some of the most advanced nuclear scientists on the planet, and some of the great minds in that space. So if they wanted to, I suppose they could turn up that volume whenever they want and produce that enriched uranium probably quite quickly.
Yeah, well, in fact, Khomeini was saying this week actually, how much they had advanced their capacity to enrich uranium. And just as a reminder to everyone that, if you're going to push us too far, don't be surprised if we end up where you least want us to be, which is, on the threshold of producing weaponized nuclear bombs. And whilst I don't think they're there, and no one's suggesting they're there, they could get there probably a lot quicker. And remember, you can't be sure that you'll get all these sites. Some of them will be known to the Israelis and the Americans, and others may not be. That's why the Israelis, for example, have been trying to assassinate so many Israeli nuclear scientists over the years.
Right, yeah.
Because they realize that perhaps the best way of slowing down this process of enrichment and the process of weaponization is to try and take out the intelligence that is required to build them. But Iran is not dependent on one or two scientists, and they're not buying their technology from the Pakistanis like the North Koreans did, and they've got their own capacity to do that. So I just don't think that that's going to something that the US is really interested in risking.
A theme of what you just sort of said there, Scott, was that, there's a sophistication to the Iranian, in their diplomacy, in their technology. I have read and heard that, behind the closed channels, that there's quite cordial kind of diplomatic relationships between those negotiation teams. Iran's been doing some pretty, razor tightrope diplomacy with the United States for a long period now. They do look like a fairly responsible and pragmatic partner to be dealing with sometimes, from what I read. I also wanted.
Can I just say there that what many people will not realize is that the Iranians are talking to the Americans all the time.
Yes.
Okay. So there's what you might used to call second track diplomacy, or you might call it backdoor diplomacy. But there are lines of communication which were established when the JCPOA was negotiated by John Kerry under the Obama administration that are still working. And so even though some of this bellicose rhetoric appears in our news reports about relations between the Israelis, Americans, and the Iranians, under the surface, there's a lot of discussion going on. And that Iranian retaliatory attack on Israel was calibrated in conjunction with the United States.
So it was like Missile Command. They got them to set up all their anti-air platforms, and they just shot them out of the sky. It was
They told them what they were going to attack, when, and where, So you've got to remember these things exist on two parallel levels. We only ever see the one that's carried in the newspapers and on the media, but under the surface, they're talking all the time. They're communicating to ease tensions, to explain things that are occurring. And those lines of communication that are established sort of in almost a subterranean way are vital in keeping things from escalating beyond the control of any one player.
It seems like there's reality and there's La La Land going on as usual, like there is everywhere. With that technological consideration, that sophistication, I just wanted to ask you before we move on about it's essentially what we're seeing with the Houthis and their ability to launch like backyard homemade hypersonic missiles that land into Ben Gurion Airport. You mentioned that Iranian salvo, the hypersonic salvo that hit into the Negev and was unable to be intercepted by their Iron Dome system. I spoke about this with another interview about the muscle memory or the software that the West looks at Israel with is outdated. You know, it's somewhere in the early 2000s. So when the West does all its diplomatic calculations with Israel, it's coming up short because Israel isn't the same country it was. Now, I think with Iran and the region and technology, from their drones to their missile technology, uh, there hasn't really been a consideration, it seems, of the effectiveness and the capability of some of these systems, especially, say, with the tail between the legs retreat of the carrier groups away from Yemen, which was primarily due to the fact that Yemen had the ability to strike those carrier groups quite easily. Is this something that's just being ignored, this capability that really has shifted the whole balance of warfare in the region against Israel, ultimately? And this is a stalemate on steroids by the looks of it, if that's the case. So, apart from Israel taking a step back, how can this conflict be de escalated and this genocide in Gaza be put on hold?
First of all, let me say those hypersonic missiles you referred to, incredibly difficult to defend against them because of their speed. And the anti-aircraft missiles technology is good, but never perfect. So there's always going to be some that will get through, and that's clearly what the Houthis know in Yemen. But every time the Americans have war gamed a naval battle in the Persian Gulf with the Iranians have won. So it's easy to overestimate the military capacity of the United States and underestimate the military capacity of its adversaries. But I think the Americans in the State Department and in the serious people in the Defense Department also know that Iran is no pushover, no matter who takes it on. The US would have to expend a lot of money to do so. One of the reasons why they signed effectively an agreement with the Houthis was to cut costs. So if you're doing that with them, you can imagine what the cost of a battle with Iran would be, what the bill for that would come in at. Yeah, you're right about Israel's technology is exaggerated in its capacity, just as Mossad's capacity is exaggerated, and significantly, its military is the prowess of its military is grossly exaggerated. I was speaking to a couple of Australian military officers who've trained with the Israelis over the years in the past, and they put them, I don't want to disparage our South Pacific friends, but they put the Israeli military in the same category as the Fijian military in terms of their skill level. So, and they rely very heavily on reservists who are poorly trained, who only sort of really part-timers who don't have the skills to carry out major operations. So we do exaggerate Israel's capacity. If you think of what they've done to Gaza from the air, and they're still getting casualties on the ground from unexploded devices and from snipers that Hamas have still got roaming around the I think it's mainly in the northern peninsula part of Gaza. That would suggest that any attack on Iran would be foolhardy, to say the least. As far as the genocide is concerned, well, what's changed, of course, significantly in the last 2 weeks, for whatever reason, is that Israel's traditional supporters in Western Europe have balked at the fact that starvation can be used as a weapon of war, because clearly you can't say, well, we're targeting Hamas by starving the entire population. So there's concerns about the culpability and complicity of Western officials in some of the court cases at the international courts that are coming up, if they don't start to distance themselves from Israel's actions in Gaza. And you're seeing a real sea change in the rhetoric coming out of Paris, out of London, out of Madrid. Many European countries now saying enough is enough. This is indefensible, nothing to do with self-defense, and we want to distance ourselves from it. Now, whether they actually go ahead and stop the armaments exports and things is another matter, but there's definitely been a significant change of rhetoric from governments in Western Europe and the United Kingdom in particular. And we're also saw, I think, a vote at the Security Council overnight, where it was vetoed by the United States, but the vote was 14-0, which tells, so every other member of the Security Council, so all the other permanent members plus the 10 rotating members, voted for a ceasefire in Gaza. It was vetoed by the United States. And I think that's a pretty good measure of just how isolated the US has become internationally on the issue. And, apart from the fact that Trump seems to have an antipathy towards Europeans anyway, there's clearly a growing belief within European governments that there's no political or military damage to be done by distancing yourself from the Trump administration. And that is a really, important development, which is going to play itself out over the full term of this Trump administration, where the Europeans are starting to look after their own defense more, not relying on the United States, deciding policies towards Russia based on their own perceptions rather than US leadership. And now, as I said, we're seeing distancing themselves from what's going on in Gaza. I mean, you could all say, it took you 600 days to finally figure out what was happening and where it was invariably going to end up. But it is a significant coordinated response and a change of direction. And it's up to now activists in those countries to really put the foot to the accelerator and keep the pressure up on those governments to follow through with their rhetoric. And we're going to see some of it this month at the UN, where the Saudis and the French have decided to jointly convene a discussion about the future of Palestine, and where you'll see, I suspect, the French and other governments, perhaps even the Australian government, recognizing a state of Palestine. So this really is a quite interesting development coming up in about, I think it's a week or 10 days, where you've got probably the most important continental European country, France, deciding to recognize the state of Palestine. And I think that's almost now guaranteed, given some of the rhetoric coming out of Israel and the US ambassador, Mike Huckabee, to Israel, who says the French should give Palestine some part of the Riviera. That seems to suggest to me that they've been notified in advance that that's exactly what's going to happen in 10 days. And I think for a country like Australia, which never likes to act unilaterally anyway on anything, it might be the opportunity to get some diplomatic cover by doing it at the same time as other states. And let's face it, the vast majority now of countries in the world recognize the state of Palestine. The countries which don't are the odd ones out.
And in this game of like ethical, moral, musical chairs that's going on right now, It seems like Australia is playing the crocodile will eat us last strategy or something here by being one of the laggiest in the OECD to make any significant action here. You know, this is in light of the British and the Canadians and even Ursula von der Leyen finally saying something. Why do you feel Australia is languishing in that cohort if the other countries have recognised that there's no political capital to be lost by taking this position? Where is the Albanese government with this right now?
Well, the most generous interpretation would be to say they wanted to get the election out of the way first, and then they would have the opportunity to do that while the opposition was trying to put itself back together with what they've got left. But you look, they would claim that the position they held was vindicated by the election somehow. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But one thing about Australia is it does respond to pressure. And, you know, if the British, the Canadians, the French, the New Zealanders, you know, the sort of stalwart traditional allies of Australia, or friends, closest friends of Australia, are doing it, the pressure to conform will be overwhelming. And remember, there are two ALP National Conference resolutions that have basically said that the government should recognise the state of Palestine. So it would be acting in its own policies by doing so, and is in fact defying its national conference by not doing so up to this point. But I think if you read Penny Wong's rhetoric and read between the lines, she's doing it very cautiously, building up the expectation that this is going to happen. And the only thing really stopping them, I think, is their sort of inability to manage the so-called anti-Semitism issue domestically. And they've allowed that to, I think, fester, some of it confected and grossly exaggerated, some of it real, but they haven't really had a good handle on that. And they're worried that if they were to go out and recognise Palestine in a couple of weeks' time, that might leave them vulnerable to accusations that they're playing softly on anti-Semitism, which has reared its head. So they're victims of their own inability to manage that domestic issue. Nevertheless, I think we'll see some change this year, because governments that are elected tend to do the most radical things, and that's a relative term, of course, when it comes to Australia, but they do tend to do their most radical policy changes in the first 12 months of their office. So if it doesn't happen in the next 6 to 8 months, it's not going to happen.
You're mentioning that the Europeans are establishing a new sort of arrangement, militarily, diplomatically, and economically in the region. Australia is languishing in many ways. We see someone like Richard Marles, though, head off to Shangri-La, almost in his own kind of hemisphere of thought within the party, and deliver his own styling of communication to Hegseth, Defence Secretary Hegseth, indicating that there's a bit of an open door potentially for the increase in military budget. So when you have our Labor Party carrying on a business as usual approach under the guise of AUKUS with Trump's Washington, does that put us in a more precarious position as far as being able to make our own sovereign choices in line with what Europe's doing right now?
Well, first of all, the so-called 3 or 3.5% GDP figure is a purely arbitrary one and really has no connection to reality, because surely you spend money on defence as required by your needs, not by some random magical percentage figure. So that's, first of all, that's the first thing I'd say about that. Secondly, Marles is doing what Marles has always done. He's always been at the right wing of the ALP. He's one of these very pro-American ALP right-wingers who simply would be just as comfortable in the Liberal Party as he is in the ALP. And he was interestingly smacked down by Albanese a couple of days later who said, we will decide on our needs what we will be spending on defence, and it won't be determined by the Americans, which was a nice put down of Marles, who had, as you said, promised to sort of to consider Hegseth's request to raise the issue of spending to 3.5%. But Marles is doing what he's always done. He's been perfectly consistent in this. It's just a policy which is widely disliked by branch members of the ALP, who are deeply suspicious of AUKUS with very good reasons, particularly the submarine purchasing component of AUKUS. I saw an article in the National Interest, which is a conservative journal, earlier in the week, which said you can, for one Virginia-class submarine, you can build 7 diesel-powered conventional submarines. So that gives you a sense of what we could be purchasing instead of going nuclear on the submarine front.
I'm a sovereign. I love the idea of a sovereign armed neutrality kind of scenario, which doesn't seem to exist in the dialogue much in Australia, in the main anyway. Do you feel that there was a sovereign inkling? I mean, this comes after Marles has essentially lit a fire within the party with his factional dispute, installing, his factional people. Could this be the start of Albanese taking a more sovereign kind of approach, feeling that he has the support of the public for something like that?
Yeah. Well, you'd have to say that. You'd like to think that. I mean, you really would like to think it. But the good news about AUKUS is that the submarines will never arrive.
We'll just lose $500 billion.
Well, how much money you want to write out a check for nothing in return is a matter that perhaps the taxpayers might want to consider next time they get to vote. But the submarines will never arrive, and we don't need them or want them, in my view. And I'm certainly not on my own in that issue. But as far as sovereign risk is concerned, or making decisions, you've got to understand that the mentality of people like Marles is that there's only a tissue paper difference between the sovereign interests of Australia and the sovereign interests of the United States, right? We used to joke about Australia being the 51st state of the United States. In his world, that would be perfect. It's a perfect fit. So the issue of sovereignty or some conflict between sovereign interests doesn't arise for him, because he's fully on board and invested in the U.S. Political climate, and this is reflected in policies towards China, which is disastrous in terms of how the U.S. is progressing there. But also it's a disaster for our outlook on all sorts of issues that the United States takes, dangerous, reckless, and maverick positions on. But for someone like Marles, the issue of a conflict between sovereign interests never arises, because he sees this as almost one entity. And he's not alone there. I mean, this was a similar position held by Julia Gillard. It's been a position held by many senior ALP ministers over the years. You might recall that WikiLeaks used to, I think they published some leaked correspondence where we had ministers, Senator Arbib, sort of running to the US Embassy after every meeting of the Rudd ministry, reporting to them, saying that if Julia takes over, it's okay, she's sound, she can be trusted. They see the United States as an extension of their own outlook on the world. They don't see any difference. That's why, if you want to find the cohort of Australians who are most dedicated to the US alliance, don't look at the Conservatives. Look at the right wing of the New South Wales ALP and the Victorian ALP in the case of Marles. These people are rusted on American firsters, and we shouldn't be surprised by any of this sort of stuff. Whether Albanese has the cojones to just take them on is another issue. I think he realizes that Trump is an electoral liability, as proven by what happened to Mr. Dutton.
Right.
So maybe he's prepared to sort of say and extend the opposition that he has towards U.S. tariffs to some components of the strategic relationship. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. But it was refreshing, I guess, to see him smack down Marles within a couple of days after the Shangri-La negotiations and meeting, because it does suggest that there's not one view and only one view within the cabinet about how to proceed on issues like AUKUS. Unfortunately, they've got too much invested in it now to sort of call for a review of it. And I suspect they'll handball that to some subsequent government over in the next decade or so. But at least it's showing that there's some diversity of position on issues like that.
So Richard Marles, I found it interesting. You said that it's the New South Wales Labor right that you'd find that would be the most pro-Washington group in major politics. It's I often wonder with the Labor Party if it spent so much time in kind of permanent opposition mode trying to win elections, that it kind of offset or outsourced elements of policy and thinking, just like the age of consultancies and things like that that have, gone into Canberra. They outsourced a lot of the unnecessary items that weren't really needed to scrap against the coalition to win elections. This was the party that defined the muscle memory of reaching out into Asia or of integrating into the region. We were still learning Indonesian in my late 90s at high schools. And then all of a sudden this group of sort of, they essentially should be in the coalition, rolled through the Labor Party with this kind of pro-America foreign policy in the shadow of Howard. Do you think that that's the case, that it's a laziness that drives it as well? Or is it an actual ideological belief? Like that picture of Marles staring up at the flag in Washington, that famous picture a couple of years ago. Is it real? Does he have the stars and stripes in his eyes? Or is he just a lazy bastard who's offset our sovereign future to a deteriorating superpower?
No, they're true believers, and they've always been in the Labor Party. You've got to remember the opposition, for example, to the Vietnam War within the ALP in the late 60s and early 1970s was run by the left of the ALP, not by the right. No, they're true believers. They're the kind of people who are quite comfortable to join in Civil War reenactments and dress ups.
Don't tell me Kevin Rudd's dressing up as a Confederate somewhere in a reenactment.
He might not, but I can tell you that there'd be plenty of others in the New South Wales right that would be more than happy to reenact. They regard U.S. history as in almost biblical terms.
Yeah, right.
And this is, you might say, an abrogation of their responsibility to run a separate country, and you wouldn't have an argument with me on that. But no, they've always been there. They've always been there. They've always been very pro-American. You only have to look at some of the right-wing think tanks, which are run by ALP or former ALP or current or aspiring ALP senators, like the Lowy Institute. Incredibly pro-American. It wouldn't matter what Trump said or did. He could not budge these people from their addiction to the US alliance and how important it is for us. And anyone who questions the value of the US alliance, even currently where opinion polls are showing some well-deserved skepticism about its value, gets jumped on from a great height because it's sacrilegious. And it's sacrilegious not just from a point of view of Australian policy, it's sacrilegious from their point of view within the ALP. And it's only people like Keating who, from his own experience of the importance of recognising how to reorientate the Australian economy away from this sort of trans-Pacific mentality towards engagement with East Asia, that broke the mold. But he's now regarded, believe it or not, as a dissident within the ALP. And I'm sure you're familiar with his comments and his feelings about Marles and AUKUS and even Penny Wong. He doesn't pull any punches, and he's from the New South Wales right. I mean, he broke that when he realised where the future was going, and you had to sort of step back from the US and re-engage with countries like Indonesia and China and Singapore and Malaysia. But he's a maverick, and that's an example of where the ALP is, that it has now rendered its former Prime Minister, who is from the New South Wales right, as a maverick critic on the fringes of policy debate. What does that tell you?
Oh, totally, and it's been trudging at odds with its membership for the best part of about 5 years now, on some of these policies at a minimum.
If you took a vote on AUKUS in the branches,
and in
the ALP
Palestine,
branches,
yeah.
or Palestine, you'd see that the gap between government policy and the preferences of the members of the ALP would be stark.
So as this faction is like shepherding, this abomination, this $500 billion abomination through, which is designed to contain our largest trading partner in Beijing, who are offering us olive branches to try and help us understand the realities in the region and the new emerging relationships within it. You spoke about war games before in the Persian Gulf. I know one war game that's probably trumping that one, and that's the simulation in the Taiwan Strait. The Rand Institute's been, rolling bad sets of dice in that war for a long time. And the Chinese missile technology, those, YJ-18s and all those sort of things that they have in place now, make the area essentially impossible to engage in a large-scale conflict. I've often thought that the US is trying to discover where it's going to draw its line, and it's going to be somewhere between Taiwan and Guam, and potentially they're going to draw a line in the water there, and hopefully split the differences. But it seems like with some of the rhetoric coming out of, say, Elbridge Colby, who's, a very big China sort of hawk, and even hearing, a recent chat between John Mearsheimer and Vijay Prasad, where Mearsheimer, who, has been a very shrewd and pragmatic kind of communicator about America's interests, essentially has put his weight behind the need for Washington to have a presence containing China in Asia, even quoting Asian nations as being weak, which I thought was an incredible statement to make in light of the developments there. Is there a rigidity and an inevitability about this conflict that we're missing out here? Or is this, is there going to be an opportunity to draw that line in the water?
Well, some of the debate is irrational and just nonsensical. For example, we're constantly being asked, why is China why is China responsible for one of the largest military build-ups in modern times? Well, surely the obvious answer is because China's economy can now afford it. That's what great powers do. They've got the money to spend on defense, and they spend it on defense. It doesn't necessarily imply some kind of strategic objective that is new, or they've identified an enemy that they want to crush. It's just the logical product of having an economy which is booming and now the largest in the world. So I don't quite know why they get fixated on this. But Mearsheimer is very good on Ukraine, very good on Israel, Palestine, and absolutely terrible on China. He's got no idea, to be honest. The idea that the Chinese would accept 100 US military bases surrounding it and trying to contain its power, and that they would be comfortable with that and not react to it or try to push back is, I think, just laughable. But China, you got to remember, for an American who's grown up in a world where the US has been the sole superpower, and having finally crushed the Soviet Union, emerges as a the unipolar moment. The idea of an emerging country on the other side, which is going to challenge US hegemony, is intolerable. So it has to be stopped, taken down. This mentality is not just in academic circles where Mearsheimer inhabits, but it's also in the Trump administration as well, which is why they find it. But they're very, very difficult to find how to confront it, because it's China's economic rise which has been driving this. And of course, the only clumsy response that Trump has managed to come up with has been to impose tariffs on Chinese imports from into the United States. And that's only going to have to be paid for by US consumers. We ought to instead have concentrated on our own relationship with China and thought beyond the next 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years, and 10 years about where we stand. For example, China's economic importance as an export market and a source of imports and as a source of foreign investment is only going to increase in the years ahead. And any challenge to that would be diabolical for our economic future. So given that's a constant and only going to increase, maybe we should have thought outside the box before joining in some kind of containment crusade that the US Navy wants to run in the South China Sea. For example, thinking outside the box and trying to negotiate a non-aggression pact with Beijing. I don't know how receptive they would be to it, but it would save us billions, hundreds of billions of dollars if we could pull it off. Some of these things are just not always about repeating what we've done the same old way for the last 50, 60, and 80 years, but to actually change our thinking and say, okay, the US has different interests at stake here. They're not the same as ours when it comes to China. So what the US wants to achieve with China is to dominate China. Well, that may not be in our interests, and we certainly are in no position to dominate China. So perhaps we should forge our own approach, which doesn't just replicate like a carbon copy of what Washington wants. Think about what our interests are, where we can save money on fruitless expenditure, on Baroque technologies, where we can avoid unnecessary strategic provocations in the South China Sea, where we can establish an ongoing, permanent, close dialogue with the Chinese leadership, because it'll be going through a transitional period at some point in the next 2 decades. So, instead of just being seen as a sort of lackey of the US, where we have no initiative of our own, no individual approach which differs, maybe we just sort of start thinking, well, we'll carve our own niche here. We'll work with the Chinese. We'll keep others informed. But the idea that China should be contained is not going to be something that is necessarily going to be in our interests. And we'll be swept up in some of the conflicts that occur if, in fact, these are seen by the Chinese as provocations. I can't see how that's in the interests of Australia in any way, shape, or form.
I think a lot of people would agree with you, Scott, and a lot of people scratching their heads at the moment too. It seems like we've had this cake and eat it too approach with China and Washington for a long time, primarily, trading as much as we can with one and hiding behind the security umbrella of the other. And now it seems like, with just this kind of loose dialogue coming out of Shangri-La, some of the ramping up in rhetoric, we're seeing the press starting to pick up whatever packages of information they start picking up of Washington, and saber rattling and drumming. The Red Alert series is probably going to do a second reappearance with Matthew Knott and Harcher. So does it feel like this has been an era of Australian diplomatic approach to the region, to America, to China, the cake and eat it too approach? Do you feel that this is on the verge of collapse, this status quo?
I think some of that rhetoric that you mentioned about which is basically xenophobia, um, is not shared as widely by um, a more informed population, which realizes that selling whiskey and wine to a growing middle class within China is a very lucrative business. And why would we want to jeopardize that by some sort of, you know, strategic frolic that has been written in Washington? You know, look, let people like Harcher and others enjoy their invitations to the right-wing think tanks in America, where they all get together and agree on how evil China is. But just keep it to yourselves, guys. You know, it's irrelevant. And they've actually they never tell you one thing, and that is what they would do. You know, one of the things that always struck me about the coalition when they dragged our relationship with China down into the gutter was what was the actual purpose of this? What was the objective behind it? There didn't seem to be any strategic plan. It was just full of anti-Chinese rhetoric.
It's interesting you mentioned, the press a little bit there as well. And I just wanted to connect the press back into this a bit. Do you think like the lack, and this is regards to every flashpoint and every foreign policy decision we make. Do you think that the press has contributed to the information landscape around security and conflict in a negative way in Australia? For example, the national broadcaster, has that done enough to inform Australians accurately about, say, the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, but also the strategic future and the realities of our region? And China.
No, it's been a huge failure, and particularly on Gaza, which must confuse their listeners and viewers who are suddenly starting to see, for the first time after 600 days, reports of the massacres, atrocities, and the mass slaughter of civilians in Gaza, which up until that stage had been self-censored. So yeah, they've let us down. But what's interesting and what's pleasing, of course, is that on the question of Gaza in particular, it's not so much perhaps as the case of Ukraine. People are sourcing their information from other places, and they're getting the video feeds, they're getting the interviews, they're getting the podcasts, they're getting the alternative insights from other sources, and that is one of the contributing factors to the decline in newspaper sales around in Australia, as well as a growing cynicism about the national broadcaster and the extent to which it's prevented from covering some of these conflicts honestly and openly, with bans on certain words that are not allowed to be used, like the so-called G word, genocide. I mean, quite absurd to do this, but they only catch themselves out, because when eventually reality dawns and people, that you can't ignore it anymore, and they start reporting about this, people are going to say, but hang on a minute, what have you been saying up until now? What's the change occurred? Where's the change occurred? This has been going on for 600 days. So they've basically painted themselves into a corner of irrelevance.
Sorry.
And that's, in my view, a good thing. I mean, it's a shame, and it didn't have to happen, but clearly they were buckling to external pressures. And as a result, they've tarnished their own reputation on accurate and informative critical reporting of these conflicts. Now, we'll have to wait and see how the next chapter of the coverage of China goes, and whether they've learned from any of those mistakes. But what we need is some sensible alternative approaches from a policy point of view, and then get the media to start reporting them. And we haven't got to stage 1 yet before we can get to stage 2. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. The what you might call the legacy media has let itself down very badly in the way it's covered those conflicts, particularly Gaza. And if it tries to reprise what it did with China in the latter stages of the Morrison government, a similar thing will happen. People will just simply turn off and tune into more reliable, more insightful, and more factual reporting.
I often wonder if, all of this sort of skewing of information, this subjective delivery of information from the pandemic, essentially all the way through to now, has rendered the whole legacy media apparatus almost null and void. And that now they're just knowing that they're sinking with the ship a little bit here. Do you feel that there's a bit of a frustration for someone like yourself? Do you get a chance to speak as Scott Burchill, an IR expert? Do you get a chance to speak on any of these platforms about some of your insights?
Well, I used to be on all the time, and I'm no longer on at all. So that probably summarizes what an answer to your question. That's how things have shifted. So I used to be on ABC morning radio and ABC morning breakfast television, but that became untenable for them for whatever reason that they've never explained. But I think the greatest threat, I think I said just in the previous answer that the influx of social media and, podcasts and interviews on the interweb are great. The one big problem is it's all fragmented. So, for example, if you're following the conflict in Gaza, you'd have your browser open to about 50 different tabs, just simply to keep in touch with the various people that you might want to listen to, whether it be Finkelstein or Harvey Schleim, or whether it be Tucker Carlson, or whoever it is. It's all fragmented across an enormous range of sites. And so the great challenge for those who want to leave the legacy media behind and move into the next era is how to bring those together. And whilst there are 3 or 4 very good websites for opinion in Australia, places like Pearls and Irritations, which I write for, ones that you've written for, The Shot, and others, it would be great if there was a one-stop shop. It would be fantastic if, okay, we've got a variation of opinion here, but at least we know where we'll find it all. And at the moment, you have to search it out. And as I said, some people just don't have the time to do that. They've got to keep their jobs going and pay their bills. But I think that's the next challenge for what you might call the alternative media providers, many of which are much superior to the legacy media in the quality of their insights and their coverage and the information that they impart. But their challenge is to overcome the fragmentation of it and bring it under one heading. It's a bit like, someone described it once to me as a bit like the difference between Apple's iPhone ecosystem and the Android system. The Android system's probably more popular and more widely used, but the fragmentation of the operating system means that not everyone using Android on different phones will be on the same operating system because they're not all compatible. Whereas under Apple, all the phones can be updated to the same operating system, so you get a unified experience. So the challenge for the alternative media, which is really a very important one, and it's difficult to overestimate how important it is to bring together some of these sites, these very important locations where people can get a quick access and easy access to a range of opinions without having to kind of search themselves through endless sites and read a whole lot of things that they then realize they didn't need to read in order to stay informed. I don't know how that can be done, but I think there's an urgent need for it.
That seems to be a shared frustration about that sort of fragmentation of information and things. Look, I don't want to take you for too much longer. I would love to just ask you one final question, backing up to that. How do you think sovereign voices can be amplified and defined in this country?
Well, I'm sort of a bit of a traditionalist on these issues. I really, I may be accused of being naive, but I really think the quality of the arguments should be the ultimate test of whether voices are heard, shared, and adopted. And you've got to win the debates. You've got to win the arguments. I am concerned about the direction, for example, that universities have gone, the curricula at universities have gone in particular, and I'm not sure whether there'll be a realignment and readjustment in the future to bring them back to the kind of teaching and research that I was more familiar with and I benefited from when I was an undergraduate and a postgraduate student. But in terms of getting the voices out there and getting them heard, they're the really smart people, the ones with the really good ideas, the ones with new ideas and challenging ideas, do tend to find a home somewhere. They're not really, I mean, obviously some will fall by the wayside, but generally speaking, the merit of the argument, the way you express your views, the way you argue your case, the way you invite responses and respond to those responses and develop your idea over time is the key priority. And whatever platform can allow that to occur is one that will grow in popularity. And as I said, at the moment, there's a sort of bewildering fragmentation of these platforms in some cases where people just say, well, I really like to watch or look at this particular website because of one particular person who writes for it, but I don't read anything else that comes up on it. And you go, well, I read him there, I read that person there, I read her opinions somewhere else. It would be great if someone could, come up with a way of bringing those voices together, not just to reflect their own particular point of view, but to give a safe home and an interesting and stimulating environment for people who want to challenge the status quo, people who want to come up with different ideas and new ideas. And let's face it, we need them. We can, retrend. We can always get retreads in our newspapers if that's what we want to read. But if you're really interested in new ideas, new responses to the challenges that we're facing today, then we really need those voices to be heard, no matter how young they might be or no matter how old they might be. And I
So
think
we need more Sam Roggeveen's and more Hugh Whites in that kind of vein that you're talking, or?
Well, look, they've changed their positions. Sam was a former student of mine, and he's changed his position dramatically since I knew him as an undergraduate. Hugh, when he was the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defence, had a very different view to the one he has now. So, it's easy to say, well, you said this then, but now you're saying this. Well, that's part of learning. You change your view. Was it Keynes who said, when I'm faced with new evidence, I change my view. What do you do? We expect people to modify their views based on their own experiences and what they read and who they chat to and the insights that they might gain at an older age to the ones they had earlier. And everyone has a valid point of view, but the ones that stand out are ones that you just recognize through experience, that this is a view I need to hear. If I'm going to look at class in the 21st century, I need to read Thomas Piketty, because he's the guy. If I want to know what has happened to Gaza over the last 60 years, 70 years, I need to read Norman Finkelstein. You just know there are certain people that you can't miss. And that's the aim that you should try for if you want to get into that game.
Thank you very much, Scott Burchill. That was a really interesting interview and great to touch on such complex topics in such a short period of time. I'd love to have you on again sometime if you'd be up for that. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Joel. It's been great.